Hello and welcome. I'm Joy Williamson Lott, Dean of the University of Washington Graduate School, home of the Office of Public Lectures. I want to thank you for joining us for the Graduate School Public Lecture titled Say Her Name, The Urgency of Black Feminism Now, with Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall. While we are eager to see you in person, we hope that in the meantime, you will find our streamed lectures and talks a great way to stay connected to the graduate school and to the University of Washington. I also want to acknowledge the many departments and people who helped make this live stream possible, including UW Communication Leadership, the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, the Department of English, the Department of American Ethnic Studies, and our talented live stream production team and graduate school staff. Thank you. Shirley Yee, Chair of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, a unit celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, will introduce Professor Guy-Sheftall.
Thank you, Dean Williamson Lott. I'm Shirley Yee, Chair of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at UW Seattle, and it is an honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall as this year's Walker Ames Lecturer. In addition to the graduate school, I would like to thank the Department of American Ethnic Studies and the Department of English for their co-sponsorship with GWiz. Dr. Sheftall's visit is especially significant to GWiz this year because it is the first event in the department's week-long celebration of its 50th anniversary on the UW Seattle campus. A PhD alumna of Emory University, Dr. Guy-Sheftall celebrates her own 50th anniversary as Professor of English and Women's Studies and the Director of Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College. Her reputation as a scholar, teacher, mentor, and activist are well known. She has been a leader of the National Women's Studies movement since its inception, working with colleagues to build curriculum and academic units at many institutions. Dr. Guy-Sheftall is a founding editor of the journal Sage. She has also published more than 40 articles and essays, as well as many books she has written or edited on her own and in collaboration with well-regarded scholars in the field of women's studies. Her works include Sturdy Black Bridges, also Gender Talk, The Struggle for Women's Equality in African American Communities with Dr. Janetta Cole, and my all-time favorite, Words of Fire, an anthology of African American feminist thought. She is currently working on a monograph on the women's movement with Paula Giddings and Gloria Steinem. In conjunction with her scholarship, Dr. Guy-Sheftall has worked with advocacy organizations such as the National Black Women's Health Project, the National Council for Research on Women, and the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. Dr. Guy-Sheftall's timely lecture is entitled, Say Her Name, The Urgency of Black Feminism Now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall.
Thank you very much, Shirley, for that generous introduction. When I was asked to deliver the Ames Walker Lecture during your week-long 50th anniversary celebration of Women's Studies, GWiz, at University of Washington, I was delighted for a number of reasons. There are very few programs that can celebrate 50 years of continuous, rigorous existence and who early on recognized the importance of committing to anti-racist praxis. I am reminded that it was only a year earlier, in 1969, that San Diego State University established the first women's studies program in the US. Secondly, the women's studies program at Spelman is preparing to celebrate our 40th birthday in 2021. So I know how important it is to pause, engage in serious reflection, and take notice of one's accomplishments and continuing challenges. Thirdly, I feel a special connection to your program because of histories I share with your university and several of your retired colleagues, Janella Butler, Betty Schmitz, Angela Genorio in particular. I am remembering with fondness the time I spent on your campus in faculty and curriculum development workshops and consulting with administrators about enabling a more inclusive campus there. I also want to acknowledge Angela's heartfelt email to me a few days ago that brought back joyful memories of productive dialogue and the importance of friendships in these institutional contexts. I want to thank you, Shirley, and GWSS faculty for having extended the invitation to me to join you this week. And of course, Molly Mandeltort for doing all the work she's done to facilitate my virtual visit. Professor Yee, your first book, Black Women Abolitionists, A Study in Activism, 1828 to 1960, remains, in my opinion, a pioneering text that is especially resonant now among a growing and long overdue body of scholarship that finally centers Black women in histories of significant political movements in the US. And I also want to say to you, The Words of Fire is also my favorite publication of mine. In preparation for tonight, I reread a large body of work which assesses the field of women's studies that began formally, of course, in 1969 in San Diego. I'm referring to Women's Studies for the Future, Foundations, Interrogations, Politics. Women's Studies on its own, a next wave reader in institutional change. Troubling Women's Studies, Past, Present, and Possibilities. I also reread my own consultant's report, The Status of Women's Studies, 1969 to 1992, which the Ford Foundation invited me to write and was published in 1995 as Women's Studies, a retrospective. Among the retrospectives I probed, the one edited by Elizabeth Kennedy and Agatha Baines posed the most compelling questions for me as I thought about this talk. What is the subject of women's studies? How does women's studies negotiate the politics of coalition building and the politics of difference? How can women's studies fulfill the promise of interdisciplinarity? What is the continuing place of activism in women's studies? And finally, how has feminist pedagogy responded to changing political realities that have become more complex and even toxic, I would add, over the past decade? Initially, my desire was to organize the talk around how I might answer these questions from my particular location as the founding director of the first Women's Studies program at a historically Black college. But after some reflection, I decided to begin the talk from a personal place. Why I was drawn to women's studies, why I'm still passionate about the field, despite its challenges, and why I think it's important for elders like myself to speak to young folks in particular about the joys of feminism and the life we chose as scholar activists. I also wanted to reflect upon the urgency of Black feminist knowledge production and activism at this juncture in this nation's very troubling history, without dwelling upon the past 4 years and presidential politics. In many ways, the genealogy of my own professional life provides a glimpse into the transformative impact of women's studies and feminist politics on professors like many of us gathered tonight. It certainly shaped my academic journey, and I include the precious time I spent at UW in serious dialogue about the challenges of making our programs and universities more inclusive around race, class, gender, and ethnicity, and exploring what it meant to be anti-racist feminist academics. I decided to engage women's studies at a historically Black college for women, whose evolving mission I wanted to help shape or transform or even radicalize. My teaching career began in 1969 at Alabama State at Black Public University, the same year that the first women's studies program began in California. 2 years later, at Spelman, where I have spent the last 50 years, I had to learn how to be an effective force for change in a context where my own ideological, political commitments around feminism were not necessarily shared at the beginning, especially among my students and even faculty and administrators. I enrolled at Emory University, as you indicated, in the doctoral program while I was still teaching. Shortly after I left Emory, they established the second doctoral program in women's studies in the US. I was invited to teach as an adjunct professor, during which I developed two courses, African American Women's History and Black Feminist Thought, which resulted in the publication of Words of Fire in 1995. More recently, Still Brave, co-edited with Stanley James and Frances Foster, was published and is a sequel to All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, the first anthology in Black women's studies. Before Professor Nellie McKay died, she stipulated that Frances and I should complete the work she knew she would be unable to do because of her failing health. I want to read a bit of what I shared at a celebration of Nellie's life at the University of Wisconsin in January 2006, as a way of remembering those Black women who had such an impact on the field of women's studies, even though they often go acknowledged. This is what I said. In those early years, 1970s and 80s, we were a small band of renegade Black women scholars, determined to chart a new course within the academy and help to transform the two most transgressive spaces in higher ed, Black or ethnic studies and women's studies. I'm speaking of Angela Davis, Nellie McKay, Barbara Smith, Barbara Christian, Mary Helen Washington, Hortense Spillers, Gloria Hall, Michelle Wallace, Bell Hooks, Toni K. Bambara, Paula Giddings, Alice Walker, Patricia Bell Scott, Frances Foster, and many, many others. Now to the meat of the rest of my talk, which focuses on the urgency of Black feminisms now. In 2014, the online publication Feminist Wire convened a special forum celebrating the life, work, and legacy of Toni K. Bambara, whose name we call at Spelman every year during her birthday month, March, at the Women's Center with a student-driven conference. In the collection of essays in Feminist Wire was guest editor Heidi Lewis's previously published piece, Feminists We Love, which she wrote for Toni's 75th birthday on March 25th, 2014. I want to cite one passage from the essay. Toni K. Bambara gave me a feminism that was Black, a feminism that was loud, strong, collective, vulnerable, powerful, communal, honest, and intimate. A feminism that was me. The kind of Black feminism that wasn't afraid to look around and that refused to suffer fools. The feminism she gave me is heavy, obliging me both epistemologically and ontologically. For these reasons, I often still wonder if I'm ready. For as she, Toni, once said, revolution begins with the self in the self. I want to testify as well to the feminism that Toni K. Bambara gave me when I interviewed her for my first book, Sturdy Black Bridges, in 1974. When I asked her whether it was a dilemma for her to be both a feminist and a warrior in the race struggle, she responded to me with such ease and fierceness. I don't find any basic contradiction or any tension between being a feminist, being a Pan-Africanist, being a Black nationalist, being an internationalist, being a socialist, and being a woman in North America. Yes, Toni's feminism was also big and bold and connected to global women's movements. A year after the interview, I learned that Toni would travel to North Vietnam with a delegation called the North American Academic Marxist, Leninist, Anti-Imperialist Feminist Women, having been invited to Hanoi by their women's union. The only Black feminists in the delegation, they had been greatly influenced by Toni's Radical Black Feminist Politics in the Black Woman, published in 1970, and wanted her to join them. Another contributor to that Feminist Wire issue was Aisha Simmons, who testified that Toni was an important catalyst for the creation of her controversial film, No, the rape documentary, which focuses on intra-racial violence against Black women. She also told us that in one of Toni's last script writing workshops before she died at Scribe Video Center in Philadelphia, founded by filmmaker Louis Massai, that she conceived of her powerful courier poem, A State of Rage. Many of us are also now in a collective state of rage at the murder of Breonna Taylor by Louisville police and the early refusal of their Attorney General, a Black Trump supporter, to bring charges against the 3 police who murdered her that night. I also want to remember my former student, now Professor Moya Bailey at Northeastern University, also outraged, who coined the term misogynoir, which describes the unique anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experience relentlessly. Her outrage resulted in action after my feminist theory class in 2006, when she provided leadership along with Asha Jennings and Liana Cabral for the soon-to-be heavily covered protests against hip-hop artist Nelly and broader issues about Black women's representation in popular culture. We continue to be outraged by the racist misogyny that Michelle Obama experienced during her 8 years in the White House, and that also was visited upon Vice President-elect Kamala Harris when she was on the Democratic ticket with Joe Biden. I won't dwell on many examples of this, but in August 2020, a car dealership in Massachusetts, not Georgia, not Alabama, not Mississippi, erected a billboard which referred to Joe Biden and his VP pick as Joe and Ho, W-H-O-R-E, except they spelled it H-O-E. Disgustingly, toxic Fox News, especially Rush Limbaugh, repeatedly claimed that Harris had brazenly slept her way into politics and slept around with married men. In keeping with radical feminist praxis, I want to remember Sakia Gunn, a 15-year-old Black lesbian who was murdered May 1st, 2003 in Newark, New Jersey, during one of the most egregious hate crimes that captured the attention of Black feminists in particular, but not mainstream women's movements or Black political organizations. I want to say her name tonight as a reminder of the Black woman hating which also occurs within our own communities, that regrettably does not get the attention or the analysis that police brutality against Black men gets, or the sexual harassment assaults garnered among the Me Too movement, which tends to privilege white women. Fortunately, a 2008 documentary was released entitled Dreams Deferred, the Sakia Gun Film Project by Charles Brack, that attempts to break these silences. I want to briefly describe what happened that night when Sakia and two friends were returning from a night out in Greenwich Village at a popular spot for queer youth. They were waiting for the #1 New Jersey transit bus in downtown Newark at the corner of Broad and Market Streets, and were propositioned by two elderly Black men. The young Black girls rejected their advances and shared unapologetically that they were in fact lesbians and therefore uninterested, after which the men attacked them. Sakia fought back, and one of the men, Richard McCullough, stabbed her in the chest and then fled with his friends. She was taken to nearby University Hospital where she died. He was charged with murder and sentenced for 20 years in prison, 2 long years after plea bargaining to a lesser charge, aggravated manslaughter. There was little media coverage outside Newark and mainly among the queer community. Unlike Black male victims of police violence, we're not likely to know Sakia's name. Her mother, Gail Guions, was not interviewed. There were no rallies, no national television coverage, no financial support for her family. While there is much needed and long overdue discussion recently of state violence against Black folks, mainly men and boys, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder at the hands of Minneapolis police, I want to share some disturbing data on gender-specific violence which Black women experience at the hands of acquaintances and partners. While we hear about homicide rates for Black men, we are not likely to hear very much about homicide rates for Black women and girls. So here's some data which has actually gotten worse. According to the 2012 report of the Violence Policy Center in Washington, D.C., 94% of Black women killed by men in single victim incidents knew their perpetrators. Nearly 15 times as many Black women were murdered by a man they knew than were killed by a stranger. According to the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey from 2010 to 2011, nationally, 45% of Black women experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetimes, compared to 30% of white women. According to CDC, Black and Native women, or Indigenous women, experience the highest rates of homicide, and over half of these are related to intimate partner violence, mostly by firearms. Native American women in particular are the victims of murder at over 10 times the national average, according to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. In fact, homicides are the #3 cause of death for both American Indian and Alaska Native girls and women between the ages of 10 and 24. To underscore that presidential elections do matter, newly appointed Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the country's first Indigenous cabinet secretary, is establishing a unit within the Bureau of Indian Affairs that will investigate missing and murdered Native Americans and appoint a unit chief to develop policy for the project. According to the Black Trans Lives Matter Coalition, their community lost in 2019 alone probably 26 transgender or gender nonconforming persons, the majority of whom were Black transgender women. I would remind us that Black transgender people have been calling attention to this crisis for years, going back as early as the 1960s, when Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Though Stonewall, considered to be the beginning of the first gay rights movement in the US, is often portrayed as a white queer mobilization. In Gender Talk, which Janetta Cole and I published in 2003, we wrote a chapter called Race, Secrets, and the Body Politic, in which we described the relentless violence against Black women and girls that included lynchings, medical experimentation, domestic and state violence. One of our favorite observations was this: we do not have, although we know she existed, a Black female counterpart to the graphic visual images conjured up by our memories of the lynching death of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, that awful August 28th, 1955 day, when his mutilated body was plucked from the Tallahatchie River. Imagine if there were a similar image of a Black female that would stay in our collective political consciousnesses around race, gender, terrorism. I am now thinking of Emmett Till's recent counterpart, George Floyd. Suppose we could rewrite history that wipes out, ignores, disremembers violence against Black women. In the face of perhaps the most egregious and pervasive examples of intersectional vulnerabilities that Black women suffer, I want to center the work right now, briefly, of the African American Policy Forum, founded in 1996 by Professors Kimberly Crenshaw, whom we remember as the person who coined the term intersectionality, and Luke Harris. While they have been dedicated to advancing racial justice, gender equality, and human rights, both in the US and globally, I want to just mention a few of their unapologetic Black feminist projects, which is not apparent by their name. Regular, compelling podcasts on intersectionality matters. Projects on Black Girls Matter, pushed out, over-policed, and underrepresented, which circulates national data and personal interviews about the greater risk of disciplinary action against Black girls in our schools when compared to white girls, and their absence from school to prison pipeline programs that focus primarily on Black boys. This is very surprising to people, these stats. This erasure led to the forum critiquing the Obama White House's much lauded My Brother's Keepers project. Were it not for the forum's powerful Say Her Name campaign and report, which raised awareness for the first time nationally of Black female victims of police brutality and anti-Black violence more broadly, it is likely that we would not be calling the names of Eleanor Bumpers. Her case goes back to 1984 in New York City, Sandra Bland, Tanisha Anderson, Rekia Boyd, and Breonna Taylor, to name just a few. And more recently, there are the extraordinary Under the Black Light webinars that have included panels on the impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, discussions of Black men for Trump, the overdue conversation on patriarchy and misogynoir in Black politics, a retrospective on the last presidential campaign and its aftermath, and what we should demand from the Democratic Party and the new occupants of the White House. Why we are still not saved, which included searing analyses of the attack on the Capitol and the impact of historic electoral wins in my state of Georgia, in spite of massive voter suppression. And finally, a recalling in the story of us of some of the ugliest chapters in our past, chillingly described by historian David Blight and Byron Stevenson, the now famous founder of the Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, Alabama, that I would encourage everyone to visit. So what is our charge now? Very simply, take seriously the dangerous world we now inhabit, which did not emerge over the past 4 years, as treacherous as those years have been, and engage relentlessly in good trouble, to borrow John Lewis's words. Listen to radical Toni K. Bambara in the preface to her 1970 feminist text. We are involved in a struggle for liberation. Liberation from the exploitative and dehumanizing system of racism, from the manipulative control of a corporate society. Liberation from the constrictive norms of mainstream culture, from the synthetic myths that encourage us to fashion ourselves rashly from without rather than from within. Remembering the spirit and imperatives of the 60s, which may be instructive now, Toni reminds us what characterizes the current movement of the 60s is a turning away from the larger society and a turning toward each other. Our art, protest, dialogue no longer spring from the impulse to entertain or to indulge or enlighten the conscience of the enemy, which he names unapologetically. White people, whiteness, or racism, men, maleness, or chauvinism, America, or imperialism. Our energy, she said, now seem to be invested in and are in turn derived from a determination to touch and unify. What typifies the current spirit, and she's talking about the 60s, is an embrace of the community, and a hard-headed attempt to get basic with each other. Last night, in memory of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.'s on April 4th, 1968, many of us listened to an incredible band of speakers read perhaps his most important and certainly his most radical speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, which he delivered at Riverside Church in New York City, exactly to the day 1 year before he was killed. I would encourage us all to listen to it again in these times, for it is still useful and largely unheeded. His anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-racist message, very different from the more famous I Have a Dream speech. So let's get basic with each other, listening to Toni. Toni continues in The Black Woman. If we women are to get basic, then surely the first job is to find out what liberation for ourselves means, what work it entails, what benefits it will yield. The roadmaps are clearer for all of us. So let us get to work. Thank you. I'm going to turn it now over to the moderator for Q&A, And I want to also share with the audience that you may ask questions now by emailing may I ask at uw.edu. May I ask altogether at uw.edu. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guy-Sheftall, for that very powerful and amazing lecture that you just gave. We have been getting questions in, and one of them seems particularly poignant given what you were just talking about with Dr. King, and that is, what have you read late recently that has made you really think or that you've really enjoyed recently?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. One of the things that I've read recently is, and I'm going to be terrible with titles, is Barbara Ransby's Keonga Taylor's analysis of Combahee River Collective, which emerged in the 1970s. It's a retrospective. I've been reading a lot of retrospectives on the Combahee River Collective, that queer Black feminist group that emerged out of the National Black Feminist Organization. I've also been reading Barbara Ransby's analysis of Black Lives Matter. You know, there's been a lot of pushback, even sometimes among the older civil rights community, about Black Lives Matter, because it doesn't necessarily follow their protocols. So I've been reading Barbara Ransby's analysis of Black Lives Matter. I've also been reading, because I'm very interested in Palestinian struggles, I've been reading, which everybody should read, Angela Davis's work about Palestine, and also her prison abolitionist work, Are Prisons Obsolete? So one of the things that I've been saying to myself, listening to a radical African feminist friend of mine, Patricia McFadden, who says every week, she says to herself, what can I do that's more radical than what I did last week? And what can I read that's more radical than what I read last week? So I'm very committed to reading radical Black feminists and other feminist writings that really tackle the kinds of issues that I'm mentioned today. And I'm very worried, actually, about where we are right now. And so I think it's really, really important for us to read and also to organize and to commit ourselves to the kind of struggle that Martin Luther King committed himself to, and of course, unfortunately, at age 39, gave his life for.
Well, that actually comes up to another question that we just got in from somebody. And what is the future, in your opinion? What is the future of Black feminism? What are the next steps?
I think the future of Black feminism is what it started out being, actually in 1832. In Words of Fire, which Shirley and many of you probably know, I went back and traced Black feminist thought from 1832 to the present. And so I would say that number one is an intersectional, that word that is, floats around but was not in our lexicon in the early 1900s. It is an intersectional analysis of all of the structures of inequality and privileging systems that situate marginalized folks, even irrespective of their race or gender, situates marginalized people within this stranglehold of oppressions. That kind of analysis is what is absolutely needed. We can't have, one issue analyses, and I think that we also cannot attach ourselves to one issue organizations. And that's what I learned when I talked to Tony Kaye, when she named all of the spaces that she occupies: feminist spaces, Pan-Africanist spaces, socialist spaces, global spaces. So for me, the lesson of Black feminism is that we have to be intersectional, we have to be local, we have to be national, we have to be global, and we have to be unafraid to name, and that was what I wanted to do, unafraid to name the organizations, the people, the treacherous things that happen in our communities and outside of our communities, in order to imagine or envision a new world and literally, as John Lewis said, make good trouble. So talking is not enough, reading is not enough. We have got to attach ourselves to struggles, national and global, that are trying very, very hard to dismantle these structures.
I think that a great follow-up question to that one would be something that we got from our audience, which is, what advice would you give to Black women professors who are trying to start a cultural program of study or even create cultural courses at lesser known HBCUs that still adhere to respectability, politics, and a male-dominated, whitewashed canonical curriculum?
That's a wonderful question. And one of the reasons that I mentioned when I mentioned, when we started the Women's Studies program at Spelman College in 1981, even though we were a women's college, and even though we had had some history of social activism around the civil rights movement, we were still in a space where feminism was a suspect political ideology. It was perceived to be white, divisive, anti-male. And what we had to do in that space is what I would argue we have been doing in other HBCU spaces with two grants that we've had. And that is, which we've done to go on HBCU campuses. You have to do this on the ground. Go to HBCU campuses, locate and identify committed faculty, and also, in most instances at HBCU campuses, and we did this, you also have to work with administrators. It is very difficult to just show up on an HBCU campus and begin to do this radical political work without some connection to the hierarchies that exist on our campuses. So we've had two really important grants that I want to just mention in this regard, and one was more controversial than the other, and that was a grant from the Arcus Foundation, the only LGBTQ sensitive queer organization. And we decided that we wanted to also address campus climate issues around LGBTQ issues, and we identified 10 to 15 HBCUs and work with them for 2 years. We also right now have a Mellon Foundation grant to establish what we call the Gender and Sexuality Studies Institute. And in that grant, we identified 20 HBCUs. And in that context, we have faculty and curriculum development projects on gender and sexuality studies. We bring folk to Spelman, and we also go to these colleges and universities. We've had very good attendance and interest. We started with Spelman, we did Clark Atlanta University and Morehouse, and next year, the third year of the grant, we will send a call out for 20 more HBCUs to work on gender and sexuality studies. So I think my advice would be, just assume that a compelling project will be embraced, and locate on those campuses what I would call comrades or like-minded faculty, staff, and administrators that will help you do the work. And even though it's been challenging and sometimes very frustrating, it has been some of the most fulfilling work that we've done at the Women's Center, with the help of grants from initially Ford, Mellon, and Arcus. So I would say, reach out to us at Spelman. Howard University just reached out to the Women's Center several months ago and asked us if we would help them, given our history, if we would help them do something around gender and sexuality studies at Howard, and we said, of course. So I would say always communal, collective, good trouble is the best way to get these kinds of projects going on HBCU campuses. And so that's what I would suggest. And I would just say what we said, it's important, and we can't let the what we perceive to be an impossible situation to keep us from doing the work. So I would say, please reach out to us at Spelman, and we can give you some very specific advice. and also some things not to do.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And it leads to another question is, what does it feel like to have such a pivotal role in the history of Black feminism?
You know, um, most, when I think about Black feminism, and I think people will not say, I think about these other women. I think about the women whose names I called. I think about Toni Cade Barrett. I think about Anna Julia Cooper. I think about Ida Wells Barnett, whom I didn't know about, even though I grew up in. I think about Barbara Smith, and people sometimes have to remind me, Beverly, you're in the same cohort with. I don't think about it so much because I'm always thinking about what other women have done. If I stop, like I'm working on a memoir right now, only in those circumstances do I stop and say, "Oh my goodness, Beverly, you've been doing this work since you were a master's student at Atlanta University in an English department, working on a thesis on Faulkner's treatment of women in his major novels. So you had no idea that that was a Black feminist thesis project." So I'm always happy when people, remind me that I was present. But most of the time, I'm thinking about all these other incredible women. I mean, I was really one of the best days of my life was when Stanley James called and said Nellie McKay, whom I had known, knew she was not going to make it. And she said she designated, you call Beverly Guy-Sheftall and Frances Foster and tell them that they have to step in as co-editors of Still Brave. That's who needs to do that. And I was kind of sort of surprised because I said, I haven't seen Nellie in a while, but those are the kinds of things that sort of remind me that people do have a memory. And maybe it was because, as I said, we were such a small little renegade group. It's not like we were in the hundreds in the academy struggling to do Black feminist work. And so I'm happy, just like I was happy when UW called me and asked me to do this lecture. I mean, there are many Black feminists that UW could have called, and so I'm always thankful. I mean, literally, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm always thankful when I'm called upon to reflect upon very old history and also the history that I have been involved in for the last 50 years, which sometimes I forget.
How would you suggest that non-academics and non-activists could gain access to knowledge about Black feminism?
I'm involved in a lot of groups, Black women's. I mean, some activist groups like Black Women's Blueprint, and even Black Lives Matter and BYP 100. Those are grassroots. I'm particularly happy about BYP 100 because that's a group of young radical Black folk, men and women, who tend to be less than 30 years old. One of the ways that I think one can get a sort of quick but important introduction to Black feminism is through looking at documentaries. I mean, when I use documentaries in various places, I'm thinking about the documentary on Lorraine Hansberry, one of the most radical Black feminist intellectuals who was not in the academy. So the Lorraine Hansberry documentary. I think about the documentary on Sakia Gunn. I think about the documentary on Reese Taylor. Reese Taylor was a Black woman who was raped by a group of white men in the 40s. And Rosa Parks, whom we don't think of very much as an activist, I mean, as a feminist or even an activist, was an anti-rape investigative journalist in the 40s and did the investigative journalism on Reese Taylor. And she died just a few years ago. But I used that documentary about Rosa Parks to underscore these, invisible, undervalued Black feminist women that we don't even put in that category. One of the persons that I talk about now very recently is Coretta Scott King, who I put her in the radical Black feminist category. She was anti-militarist. She was anti-racist. She pushed. I was thinking about Coretta Scott King last night when I was listening to the anti-Vietnam speech. It was Coretta Scott King, who was a pacifist at Antioch College, who kept pushing Martin Luther King toward an anti-war position. And so I locate her when I'm, talking to, not just, on college campuses, and people are really, really stunned. So I think telling stories about women that people don't locate in that space, and also showing films is what I would say is a way to get started.
That's great. That's wonderful advice. And we have time for just one more question, but before I ask the question, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Guy-Sheftall, for this wonderful lecture that you gave. The last question that we have from our audience that we'd like to pose to you is, how were you able to bridge the divide of being a Black activist versus a Black woman?
So, I think it has to do with the fact that I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, in the civil rights movement. And so I grew up surrounded by activist folk in the movement. And I never saw a disconnect between, and I think if you grew up in the 50s and 60s and Jim and Jane Crow, Memphis, Tennessee, with horrendous racial apartheid that my parents talked about on a regular basis. I mean, I grew up hearing my grandfather talk about lynchings in Mississippi, where he grew up. So I think that has a huge impact on my political consciousness and journey. In other words, I thought it was my responsibility as a Black woman surrounded by horrendous racial terrorism. I didn't have much of a gender analysis at that point, but surrounded by racial terrorism and in a family that constantly talked about this, that there was just no contradiction, and that it was my role as a somewhat privileged Black girl who was able to go to college and who was able to be a college professor, that it was my responsibility to do something about all of these horrible circumstances that people found themselves in.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Guy-Sheftall.
Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to visiting Seattle post-COVID and coming on campus and having the kind of fun that I had many, many years ago.
Excellent.
And I will be in class on Tuesday, I think. So I will see some of you again. So thank you very much.